This election campaign, your social feeds will be filled with more content than ever that is designed to influence how you think, how you engage, and ultimately how you vote. From AI deepfakes to bots, it is hard to know what's real. Ahmed Al-Rawi is an associate professor of news, social media, and communications. He leads the Disinformation Project, an initiative that explores fake news in Canada, and he has seen several suspect stories cross his feed.
One showing Mark Carney in a swimming pool with Jeffrey Epstein. If you look closely in the picture, you can see a lot of distortion, especially in the background. Especially that some of the human bodies, do not look normal.
That image has been debunked by the fact-checking site Lead Stories using AI detection tools. But not everyone is as media savvy as a media studies professor, and not everybody is willing to take the time to figure it out. Today on Blue Sky, we're going to learn about how and why foreign agents are trying to interfere in our federal election. We'll give you some tips on how to check on if something is fake or if it's not. And we'll also talk about the strain all of this can cause on relationships. For example, when maybe a loved one starts believing conspiracy theories. If you've been seeing fake news circulating during this election call, 1-800-716-2221 or email us bluesky@cbc.ca. Okay, we have two main guests today. Matthew Johnson is the Director of Education for Media Smarts, Canada's Centre for Digital and Media Literacy. They've been doing research about how to best help people recognize and respond to misinformation. He'll also tell us about their Break the Fake campaign, encouraging people to do fact-checking and avoid sharing false information. Our other main guest today is Brian McQuinn. He is the co-director of the Centre for Artificial Intelligence, Data and Conflict, and also an associate professor of international studies at the University of Regina. They are both a wealth of knowledge, so get your questions in for them now, 1-800-716-2221, or send us an email, bluesky@cbc.ca. I'm very curious if we're going to debunk something in real time. We have an hour. I guess it could happen. So if you have something for us, send it to us, bluesky@cbc.ca, or give us a call, 1-800-716-2221. Matthew, Brian, thanks so much for being here today.
It's a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Okay, Matthew, we're going to start with you. You have a full report coming out this month about what kind of digital media literacy works the best, but you've already released some key findings. Tell me what you found.
Well, what we found, first of all, was that Canadians in general feel that it's almost impossible to verify all of the information that we encounter in a day, that we're just dealing with so much information through so many different channels. It's just really not possible. At the same time, most of them also felt that they were pretty good at recognizing true or false information. When we actually put them to the test, though, we found in general that they were not very good at it, that they tended to rely on a small number of shortcuts, some of which were more effective and some of which could be quite misleading. But we also did find that short interventions, and when I say short, I actually mean videos between 30 and 45 seconds, did make a measurable difference in both how successful people were at verifying the information they encountered and their intention to verify and whether or not they would share information.
Can you give me an example of what some of those shortcuts are that people have been using, just for my own interest's sake?
So two of the big shortcuts are the truth bias and the false bias, which simply means that when you're not sure, you default to believing something is false or not trusting it or believing that something is true. And one thing that was really interesting was that in the large-scale survey, we found people generally had a falsehood bias, that they were more likely, all else being equal, to consider something was false. When we did focus groups where we showed them those videos and talked to them about their process, they were a little more likely to say that it was true. So the context seems to matter a lot in those shortcuts. Another shortcut that we found was people looking at kind of trusting their gut about whether or not something basically looked fake, which can sometimes be helpful when things are obviously fake, but can be very misleading as well. And we also found people strongly vulnerable to something that was fake, but was about a real topic. So one of the images that was consistently judged by participants was a deep fake of Henry Ford with one of his prototype quad cycle, which is the predecessor of the car. Henry Ford, of course, was a real person. He really did have a prototype quad cycle. There are real photos of that, but the one that we were showing people was a deep fake that has been widely distributed. And so it seemed that the fact that it was about someone they recognized, about something that seemed plausible, made people less skeptical, less prone to thinking critically about this image.
When you talk about the tendency to skew negative, to not trust it, is that something you've seen shift over the years? I just think of the dialogue around not trusting the mainstream media. Is that something that you've seen shift because of that dialogue, or is that where the default space was before and maybe we just didn't realize it?
No, I don't think it was the default before. I think very much up until probably about 15, maybe 20 years ago, the default was to maybe think that you had to think critically about things that you encountered, but to assume that what you were looking at was basically true, or if that it wasn't, there would be clear signs. Because, of course, in the old information ecosystem, you could easily tell the difference between the New York Times and the National Enquirer. You could tell the difference between a professionally published book and some pamphlet that someone handed you on the street. Today, it's just as easy to make a fake website as a real one. It's easy to spoof real news sites. And of course, we get most of our news through social media anyway. But the other thing that I think has changed things is that for a long time, the instruction people got, whether that was literal instruction in school or just sort of general advice, was to not trust everything that they saw online. And that's good advice, but it's only good advice if you follow it up with information, with training on how to verify what you're seeing online. If we tell people just don't believe what you see online, then we do see that false bias coming in where people are likely to reject things that are true, particularly things they don't want to believe are true. And a lot of people who talk about deepfakes and other examples of AI feel that that is the biggest threat. Not that they're going to be fooling a lot of people, but that they provide us with a way of dismissing things that we don't want to believe because we say it could be a deepfake.
I don't want to divert the conversation here too much, but I do want to talk about mainstream media and how reporting has changed, though, too, because 15, 20 years ago, the mainstream media didn't report entertainment stories the way they do now. Entertainment shows had a far bigger footprint of their own. Things I think back to things like Entertainment Tonight, right? Where that's where those things kind of lived. But now that there's reporting of, I don't want to call it gossip because we don't report gossip, but there are a number of sites like TMZ that do sometimes get it right, are sometimes factual. Does that skew with the believability of the media as well?
I think it can. I mean, certainly we've had to reappraise who we consider to be a reliable source. We've seen at the same time, the increase in openly partisan news sources, some of whom have good quality news, but put it in the context of a partisan editorial framing. And one of the other things that we have seen a lot, even just sticking to real news, is a shift in the balance where more and more content is opinion relative to news. And I think that is because, first of all, with the introduction of cable news channels, there simply was not enough news to fill 24 hours. And now, of course, with social media, with the internet, you need to have more than 24 hours of programming. You need to have constant programming. There's simply not enough news. And of course, news is more expensive to produce than opinion. Opinions, famously, are very near to free. So I think we have seen a shift. And I think that is a big part of why a lot of people, especially young people, don't really understand what reliable news sources are providing. They don't understand what distinguishes a reliable news source. And they don't understand that just because something is a reliable news source doesn't mean you accept it uncritically. It means that it's reliable enough to be worth your close critical attention.
Okay. The CBC's Farah Nassar has been reporting on election misinformation. She recently made a video for TikTok that breaks down some things that people really do need to watch for. Have a listen.
I just did a story on this for CBC's The National, and here are 3 things that surprised me. Number 1, hijacked Facebook groups. So you know those old buy and sell groups that you might have joined and maybe even forgot about? Well, for as little as a few $100, someone could buy one of those groups, rename it, and then use it as a political propaganda machine.
This is a great example of a Facebook group marketplace. We can see we have 193 pages of available groups. If you want a group in Europe with 1,000 members, it's $50. North America, 5,000 members, it's $300. If you've got a fair amount of money, $600.
100,000 people.
100,000 people.
So check those dormant groups because they might be trying to influence you without you even realizing it. Number 2, deepfakes are so advanced now that the experts I interviewed, the people who deal with this day in and day out, say even they get fooled. And in some cases, they need specialized tools to tell the difference.
OpenAI released their GPT-4o or their 4o image generation, which is just a remarkable image generation tool that can create very lifelike images and don't have those early tells people were making fun of, the people only have 4 fingers or no thumbs, and we're way past that already, and it's just been a couple years.
So as always, cross-check your sources and make sure you check credible news outlets.
One of the key defenses is a more savvy public.
Number 3, bots. They are smarter than ever and they are cheaper to buy. For as little as 20 cents a bot, you can flood social media sites with messages that sound eerily human.
There's this unique kind of combination of technologies that's now available to people trying to manipulate public opinion. Rampant bots across almost all social media platforms and generative large language models that can produce very similar to human text and can kind of reason in a similar to human way.
So if you notice repetitive messaging or phrasing that sounds the same, it might actually be an orchestrated campaign. And what's happening in the background of all of this is the social media safeguards that we're used to from previous elections, well, they've pretty much disappeared. Instagram and Facebook, for example, has blocked all news in Canada and removed fact checkers. And then under Elon Musk's leadership, X has actually gotten rid of a way to report political misinformation. So who's holding these tech companies accountable? Well, no one. Elections Canada says the platforms are essentially self-regulating.
Well, that sounds like the Wild West.
It is.
Brian, you had many physical reactions to that story. Why do people create this chaos? Why are there deep fakes? Why are there bots? What is the purpose of this? And how much effort does it actually take to create?
Well, it takes that itself. It takes special agencies. It takes special organizations who are doing this. The reason I was reacting is I think it was a very good summary of a lot of what we're seeing and a lot of the sort of key issues and key dynamics. So I think it's always important to take a step back. Given that these elections, I think, have changed quite dramatically from what we saw, there a lot of, I think, events are sort of taking over the election. But in much closer elections, there are a lot of dynamics that I think we need to pay more close attention to. And I think it's important that we look at, sort of, for example, Russian influence operations. These are the type of actions that are not happening sort of in these obvious ways, these sort of really, deep fakes that are either kind of really obvious plays, but it's actually much more subtle. And it's really about how we talk about different political parties. It's how certain ideas work their way through the various different ecosystems. And so you have entire organizations who are pumping billions of dollars into influencing how we think about not just our election, but usually more about Ukraine and trying to undermine support to that. We've done a lot of work around that. And some of those networks are some of the most influential networks in Canada.
Explain. What do you mean?
So in which way?
How are they influencing?
So what we're able to do is we compared the entire population of our members of parliament and said, okay, let's look at that ecosystem as a comparison. And then we looked at the ecosystem which was actually sort of being weaponized to undermine support from Ukraine, which was both far right and far left, and said, okay, what's the size of this network? How much do they produce? So these far right, far left networks that are undermining support to Ukraine produce 27 times more than the entire network around our members of parliament, and they have 4 times more engagement than the entire network of our members of parliament and how they operate. Just get a sense of how influential they can be within that ecosystem.
And when they're trying to be influential, what are some of the things they're trying to influence?
In this case, and most recently, it's about sort of support for Ukraine and whether there should be, and stories and narratives around, and I'm not going to get into the specifics of it because it's just going to propagate all the same narratives over again. But basically, just trying to find ways of sort of destroying any support in Canada for Ukraine and looking to understand from various different sources how they can very subtly manipulate communities that are sort of organic. And this is one of the most important pieces, and it was touched on by Matthew, is most disinformation is passed on by average Canadians. And it's not that they necessarily believe it, is that they actually will click through without really looking at it very closely. If it aligns kind of with what they think, they will click through. And that's actually one of the biggest problems. But for them, it's trying to find ways of getting the average Canadian to send this message to their networks, because that's how you have the most influence. Having sort of bots, and while they're important in some places, the really effective disinformation is finding ways of organically getting your message into ecosystems that are made up of friends. Because one of the things that is very important to always understand is who sends a message does affect how people read that message. We can look at the actual link itself and the content, but if it's sent by your best friend or by someone that you trust, it changes how you receive that message. And yes, you can be critical, but it lowers our guard in some ways than if it's just some random ad showing up on a Facebook page.
So you're telling me if me as a news lady sends a link to my friends, it might hold more clout than if it comes from like a crazy uncle?
Well, if you were saying that you were clicking on some of the ads to see where they went, the thing is that once when you there's a natural curiosity that people have.
I did,
and so especially, and this is the really powerful thing, and in some ways we've seen more scams. And this is an opportunity where people are already heightened to want to click on sort of controversial stories or things that, clickbait in some ways, and it's done more for scams and done for, crypto and all these other kind of schemes. It's there because we're already primed to want to like, oh my God, no, or I can't believe, or yes, haha, I knew it.
Yeah, in my case, it was on Facebook and it said cbc.ca as the link.
Exactly.
And I went, there's no way, because Meta doesn't allow us to be on there. And so, of course, I went on and reported it.
Yes.
But if you're not paying attention and you think, oh, here's a CBC article, and you're not as in the loop on what's allowed and what not allowed, you might click on that just thinking it's a news story.
And you might also think that Facebook would prevent scams from actively using their network and sponsoring ads on their pages. Like you would think that Facebook would have some degree of responsibility or care for what goes on there. There is almost none now. And this is, I think, the other thing too, is Facebook was kind of always sort of seen as a relatively safe place because, there was a lot of effort done in North America to do this. Most of that is gone. And so there's a lot more vulnerability, and I'm not sure that people are always used to it in that sense or are prepared to deal with it in the same way.
Matthew, you have some information about what some things people can do before they, even maybe before they click. In my case, I mean, I knew it was a scam when I clicked on it. I just wanted to know where it was going. That's the natural curious news lady in me. But when it comes to average people, and you see something that comes up, and in a lot of cases, it's designed to make you feel some kind of way, so that you click on it, whether you share it, you read it, you get mad at it. Give me like 3 tips for how you can quickly in the moment digest that without getting a virus.
Of sorts.
Well, what we really recommend, first of all, is one good shortcut is becoming aware of how something makes you feel. Now, that's not a sign that it's reliable or unreliable. Sometimes true news stories will provoke really strong emotions. But it is a sign that we need to be a little bit more skeptical. That's what we call intellectual humility, where you're conscious of your own biases, you're conscious of your own reactions, and you take that in mind as you're considering it. A couple of other things that you can do are, first of all, check fact-checking tools. Things like Snopes, other organizations have fact-checkers where if it's a very explosive claim, you can easily check to see if someone has debunked or verified it already. And we actually have a fact-checking search engine on our website that searches more than 20 of those fact-checkers all at once. And then another thing that you can do is to check it against sources that you know are reliable. So if it's a news story, you can go to your favorite news source, or you can use the News tab in Google, which, unlike the All tab, only includes real news sources that really exist, and see if other people are covering this story. And that's also a great way to find out if the original story maybe isn't lying, but also maybe not giving you the whole story or maybe emphasizing certain details.
Snopes has been around for a long time, but for people who've never heard of it, can you quickly tell me what it is and who's doing the fact-checking there?
So Snopes is, I can't say for certain it's the original, but it's certainly one of the oldest and best known fact-checking sites on the web. They started out fact-checking what you might call urban legends, but fairly quickly got into things relating to science, relating to politics, relating to news. They have professional fact checkers on staff, but every fact checker, every organization has its strengths and weaknesses. They have their blind spots. They have things they cover more or less of. And of course, like all people in all organizations, they have their biases. And that's why we do recommend checking more than one. And the search engine is a great way. And also, making sure, if you are looking at one, that they're a member of the or a signatory to the International Fact-Checking Network's Code of Principles, because just like anyone can set themselves up and say that they're a newspaper or an institute online, anyone can say that they're a fact checker. So do check that they are a member of the IFCN before you believe them.
I'm Sam McKeag. Today on Blue Sky, we are talking about deepfakes. We're talking about scams. We're talking about interference when it comes to the federal election and misinformation. My guest today, Matthew Johnson, the Director of Education for Media Smarts, Canada's Centre for Digital and Media Literacy, and Brian McQuinn, the Co-Director of the Centre for Artificial Intelligence, Data and Conflict. We have a third guest coming in, and I will get to her in just a moment. But before we do, I wanted to talk about how this is interfering in our Canadian election. Matthew, how have we seen it so far pop up? And then I'll let Brian respond.
I think if we're talking about this election in particular, we haven't seen anything that has had a major impact yet. We certainly have seen some deepfakes that have circulated that were mentioned, some of which were mentioned earlier. We have seen a couple of cases where people doubted that something was real when it actually was, because of the awareness of how much fake content is going around there. I think we're still, to a certain extent, benefiting from the fact that Canada is a relatively small country, that the efforts are still relatively amateur or very tightly focused on specific issues that aren't that salient in this current election.
Can you give me some examples of things that people thought were fake that were actually true?
Well, I've seen one that was a video that was, I believe, made by Andrew Scheer, that a lot of people were skeptical of.
Are you talking about the beer video?
Yeah. And of course, we've seen a good example of offline disinformation, of course, was the planting of the Stop the Steal buttons at the Conservative event last week, where pretty immediately was revealed that it had been done. That these were fake buttons, that they had not been created by the Conservative Party. And so that one was one, again, that was revealed pretty quickly, but it's hard to say what impact it might have had, particularly because clearly the intent was to tie the Conservatives more closely to Trump and that political movement in the U.S.
And I think it's important that most of what we've been seeing is actually looking at the scams and looking at getting people to sort of, because they're primed to read news related to the election, to click on things that might. And so I think that's more of what we've seen than anything else, and that's been good in that sense. But I think it's important that we always take a step back and look at the broader trends. I mean, the reason why disinformation is continually put into our system, and especially amplifying some of the conflict that exists between different sides, is that whether it be Russia or China, there is always a desire to want to sort of tear down and ensure that these idea of these democracies not working and that conflict is so severe that is sort of amplified so that it actually reduces pressure on those regimes, because it looks like democracy is a basket case. And so it's always important that we sit back and realize that that's a longer term process, and those are going to be amplified also just with the conflict, and which makes it so hard to deal with, because people can have legitimate concerns and have legitimate issues, but a lot of those get amplified more than would otherwise be the case, and they become to appear as if everyone were saying that, when in actual fact that's the artificial part.
I guess there's also the example of Premier Mo last month, where there was that cryptocurrency scam using his image as well, right?
That's exactly right.
At any level of politician could get stuck in one of these fakes.
Because you always have to remember, it's not about, and this is a cybersecurity thing, they're hacking humans. They're not hacking your system. They're trying to hack your brain and try to figure out what are you more likely to trust? What are you more likely to get angry at? They're actually hacking you. And I think Matthew's point of, like, if you have a reaction, that should be your first, because as soon as you have an emotional reaction, your cognitive capacity changes and it actually is reduced. And that's part of the point, is that the decision then to click on it is basically taken away because you're emotional. And so this is basically hacking human beings at our sort of core level. And that's why it can be very effective.
Okay, we want to hear from you today as well. 1-800-716-2221, or send us an email, bluesky@cbc.ca. Have you seen any of these fakes show up in your social feed? Have you reported them? Have you fallen for fake news? I think talking now about emotions of this is an excellent time to bring in our next guest. What do you do when you and a loved one get your media from very different sources? I'm not talking about getting it from CBC, CTV, or Global. I'm talking about all of the other places that you can find information, typically on the internet. Our next guest has some tips that might save your sanity and maybe some of your relationships. Kara Fletcher is an associate professor in the Faculty of Social Work at the U of R. She's written an article for The Conversation called Love in the Age of Conspiracy: 5 Tips to Deal with Disinformation and Political Polarization in Relationships. And she joins us now. Hi, Kara.
Hello.
You're listening to all of this. What is going through your mind as you're thinking about how all of this affects relationships?
I was thinking, actually, I think a lot of the tips provided are really accurate for couples who might be experiencing this, or other people in their family relationships. Looking at how to make sure you yourself are accessing reliable news sources, knowing how to do that, and then gently sharing that with your loved ones. So I think it was really useful information.
Is gently the key word there?
I think so. I think we have good evidence that as they were talking about, in terms of if something's affecting your emotions, your cognitive capacity to kind of think critically can get shut off. And so I think if you're really going at someone about their viewpoints, they're more likely to double down than they are to say, oh, you've got a reasonable point there. So I think the more gentle we are in our exposure to reliable news, exposure to ideas that combat misinformation and conspiracy theories, the more likely we are to have our loved ones come back on side with us, I think.
In your piece, you say the World Health Organization has declared we are living in an infodemic where misinformation is spreading like infectious disease. How many Canadians believe at least one conspiracy theory? I don't mean like dabble in it or have that like, could it be true? But like actually believe it to be true.
Yeah, so there was a poll done that I think it was Leger that did it, and it was around 83%. So a pretty big number of Canadians believe at least one conspiracy theory.
Explain what a conspiracy theory is for people, because I think it's a word we hear a lot, and it's a trigger word for some people.
Sure.
What is a conspiracy theory?
So it's a belief that there's some sort of secret organization that's become known about that's responsible for an event or a phenomenon. So we can see there's been conspiracy theories certainly about vaccines, about COVID-19, about climate change. There was even one in that folks have been joking about around whether birds are real or not. So I think you can see conspiracy theories are widespread and about pretty much anything you can imagine.
Who's most at risk for believing them?
That's a good question. I think the latest information is that actually adolescents, like youth, are the most at risk. We also know that seniors can be at risk too, depending on how to access information, what information they're accessing. They're not as digitally savvy as younger folks. So I think we're seeing kind of both ages of or both ends of the age spectrum being at risk.
In your practice, what have you seen when it comes to this and relationships?
I think it's been pretty interesting. I would say since Trump version 1 in 2016, and then certainly the pandemic, I've had more and more people coming in and saying, I don't recognize the person I married anymore. When I married them, they were this reasonable, lovely human being. And now they're telling me that COVID was a hoax, that they're deeply entrenched in some pretty problematic news sources that aren't really news, and they are angry. And so they don't know what to do, and they're worried about the impact of that on their children. They're worried about the longevity of their relationship. There's a bunch of concerns that get raised there. So I've definitely seen that with increasing, I would say the frequency is increasing as we go here, which is pretty interesting.
If this is a hot button issue for you, if you want to talk about maybe how you've dealt with some big rifts with loved ones, or maybe you have a question for Kara on how to deal with it when it comes to sources of trusted information, you can give us a call, 1-800-716-2221, or send us an email, bluesky@cbc.ca. So the question is, Kara, hypothetically, you have a family member who has gone deep down a rabbit hole, a political rabbit hole, one that is led by political beliefs. How do you try to get them out? Do you avoid? Do you converse? What's your advice when you don't want to cut off a close family member, but it can lead to some real uncomfortable family dinners?
Yes, absolutely. I think the first thing is kind of protecting your own space around this, keeping your own feet firmly on the grass here, making sure that you don't fall prey to the echo chamber of your family members' belief. Relationships are little microcosms, and sometimes we, start to think like each other, vote like each other, do like each other. And so I think making sure that you have other supports outside of that family member who might be expressing those beliefs, following those particular theories, or adopting certain aspects of misinformation. I think that's the biggest one. So kind of taking care of yourself. And if you find you don't have supports within your family or within your friend group, reaching out for some professional support, I think, is also very legitimate there, just to make sure that you're feeling grounded yourself in what is real, what is truth, and what is not, as I think that can get pretty confused. I think we can all, certainly be susceptible to many kinds of misinformation. So it's really easy to kind of be in a relationship and start thinking, oh my gosh, maybe they're right. Maybe they're on to something. Maybe there's something wrong with me. Those are certainly conversations I've had with others.
You say not to shame and blame, that emotional arguments don't work. It is hard when you get frustrated with someone not to have an emotional response, especially if it feels particularly out there. Why doesn't this work? And how do you, because as we've talked about, misinformation is all about making you feel some kind of way. So how do you rein in your own emotions to try and get through to them? Or do you bother? I know that that's a terrible thing to say, but when do you know when to disengage?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question that I don't know that I have a perfect answer to. I think there's certain things that you just can't stay silent when you hear, and there's other times when you're at the holiday dinner table and you're hearing some sort of misinformation.
That's always where it happens.
It is really, yes. That's coming up this weekend, but I think you can gently challenge, offer different perspectives. I think that conversation around intellectual humility is really important here, like being aware, being curious yourself about different viewpoints, because I think if we kind of jump on someone, they're going to feel threatened and they're going to shut down. We're not going to get anywhere useful. So I think being curious about why people hold these ideas, where do they get them from, even though you might feel that rage within yourself rising, I think kind of slowing down and trying to have those conversations in an open and gentle way where possible. And so I'm saying that with certainly the caveat that it's not always possible.
I do have a family member who actually left social media because he realized that it was making him angry, and it wasn't, and I would say he's more on the fringe side of things versus the mainstream side of things, but he could tell he was being pulled in that direction and he didn't want to live in that space anymore. So he just straight up left social media. And I think that that's what's driving a lot of these. I don't want to call it radicalization, but I think, Brian, you probably would. Let's talk about your own personal experience. Brian, Matthew, we'll start with you on how you two are very plugged into what's true and what's not. What do the dinner table conversations look like at your house? I bet you're real fun.
Luckily, we don't have a lot of problem in my house, so far it's been fun. But although there are some times with my mom where it's my normal sort of intellectual self goes right out the window because there's just certain people and family members who will trigger you in ways that nobody else will. But I think one of the things that's really important is that once you believe and are starting to get invested in one conspiracy, then the next one comes easy, and so you end up with this ecosystem of conspiracy theories. These things are not sort of isolated. They become an entire way of understanding the world, and then they become interconnected. And that's what, QAnon was kind of like taking every conspiracy theory in the world and combining it together into one super theory. And so the problem is that once you end up in that world and everything, then the next one that comes, you're like, aha, that makes sense because it conforms to my view of the world. And that's what makes this really challenging, especially if someone has been there for a while, because it's really their identity at that point. And so this isn't about like, hey, can you show me the information? It's about how do I understand the very nature of the world and the sort of motivation of certain actors and how I play a role in that. And one of the things that I think that's often not expressed as much is often conspiracy that gives people a sense of agency. And when people don't often have a sense of agency. And I think it's actually very powerful in that sense of like, aha, I've figured something out that nobody else has. And therefore I have the truth. That feeling in a world where, people struggle in all kinds of different ways can be a really nice thing. So if you don't replace that with something, you're only replacing it with a sense of like chaotic disorder and confusion. And in a world of uncertainty, it feels good to be certain about something. Exactly. Matthew, what about your dinner table? What about your relationships? Let's get very personal here.
Yeah, no, actually, it's funny because I've actually had a chance to use my kids sort of as guinea pigs in the sense that I've been. They've always been really interested in video games. And so when they first started, for instance, watching YouTube or going online, a lot of it was to find out lore, to find out information about video games. And so they would tell me about, for instance, there's this persistent urban legend in Minecraft about this character called Herobrine that there's this legend that it keeps getting reinserted into every iteration and then taken out again. It sort of haunts Minecraft. And so we would use this as an opportunity to talk about, well, how could we find out if that's true? Why might we think that's probably not true? What evidence would make us think that it was or wasn't true? Where could we go to find that out? So, I think one of the things that a lot of people at MediaSmart say is that when they're talking to people they know, after a while, everyone they know starts by prefacing a story with, well, I haven't checked this out yet, but, because they know we're going to come back and we're going to say, well, okay, where did you hear that? What made you think it was true? But I think, one thing that's really important that I want to echo as well is, how susceptible we are to misinformation or to conspiracy theories. It doesn't just come down to who we are, it comes down to our context as well. And there's a reason why the beginning of the pandemic, the early pandemic, was such a flashpoint for that. And it was because, first of all, because we felt powerless.
That
and so
uncertainty,
we were looking to
right?
make sense. Yeah. But also because we were bored. And there's a lot of evidence that just boredom is strongly correlated with all kinds of negative online behavior, everything ranging from simple trolling to getting involved in conspiracy or even hate movements. So, one thing is, find better things to keep yourself busy.
With your kids,
so
especially.
that you're
Get a
not
hobby.
getting down
Get a
rabbit
hobby.
hole. And that's something that we can do for people in our lives, that if we can be with them in a context where we don't have to talk about that stuff. Of course, everyone has to, you have to protect yourself. You have to respect your own mental health. But if you can, spending time with people outside of that context can really help them get out of that rabbit hole. And there are a lot of people who've been involved in conspiracy theories who have said that sometimes it was just a small thing that got them to doubt it when they've come out. And so being a source of information, because conspiracy communities are self-sealing, when you're inside a conspiracy community, you never hear anything that challenges that conspiracy theory. So being a source of just everyday information that's coming from outside of that world can be tremendously, tremendously helpful in helping someone get even partway out.
Kara, as a counselor, I go to counseling once a month. I think everyone should. I think it's important. But there is a saying that you'll hear from the therapy community, which is go touch grass. And that's what this is making me think of, is like step off the internet, get in the real world, and go do something. Does that resonate with you?
Yes, very much. I think I probably say that every day, to get outside, to have conversations with real people in front of you, practice being bored,
Okay.
to do other things, that aren't scrolling on your phone.
I think that's a hard one to teach kids, though, too. I know we're going through that in our house. The automatic default when they're bored is to pick up their phone. And so having that, let's play a game, let's go for a walk, like it's more work for us, but I feel like it keeps their brains from turning into goo. I do want to go to the phones. Wayne in Beaver Flats is on the line. Wayne, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I find that maybe the last 10 years, certainly since the COVID pandemic, is that I find that opinions have become stronger, and those opinions are supported by articles on the internet. And if you can Google it, it's got to be the truth. And I know that the rabbit hole and the conspiracy theories had the potential of dividing my inner circle, which includes my family. And finally, as the patriarch of the family, I had to say, listen, let's respect each other's opinion and views, but please, let's not let it divide us as a family or close friend. Let's agree to disagree if that's what it takes. But let's not let all these conspiracies divide us, because I myself think that maybe there's some truth to the saying that maybe that's what some people or some group is trying to do, is to divide us. So that's how I deal with it when it's in my space. Let's agree to disagree, and let's carry on with going out and touching the grass, as one of you said.
Thanks for that, Wayne. Brian, did you want to touch on that?
No, and this is, we've talked about this before when the research shows that at the core of some of these very controversial issues, you will have Russian influence networks at the core of them on both sides. So their job is to amplify and to intensify the hatred, intensify the emotions where the other side doesn't have a different opinion. They are wrong. They're
Do you
the
think
enemy.
it's fun to be these people?
I imagine probably not, but at the same time, these are like factories. Imagine hundreds of people and thousands of people, and there's been a lot of research, not research, but there's been a lot of stories interesting on how these things are done. These are often people working in different languages, doing things
I
across.
just say that because sometimes it's fun to be devil's advocate.
Maybe that
listen,
says
being
more about
devil's-
you than it does.
But being devil's advocate and spreading misinformation are not the same thing.
No, and I think this is where the evidence is very clear that these things are amplifying, and I think that the previous caller really puts his finger on it, where it's like these sort of disagreements before might have been something you kind of laughed about or talked through, but it's that intensity of now you are no longer like, I can't even know you, that somehow you are no longer valid as a human being in some way. Mm-hmm. That kind of amplification and ratcheting up, I think that's part of what we're talking about. These are longer term trends. And so this is why sometimes, even though this election has not been, we don't have a lot of examples of it, these broader trends are actually what in some ways are worrying me more, because the problem is there's a really dangerous other element, which is social media. Mm-hmm. They want to keep you on there as long as possible. So you have the smartest people in the world trying to figure out ways of keeping you on social media while all the disinformation is there also behind the scenes. And so you're actually fighting against multiple really large forces in society.
And trying to keep our brains from going to goo. Kara, any thoughts, final thoughts from you on relationships as we get closer to the end of the show? And then Matthew, I'm going to get you to tell people where to go for help. But Kara, final thoughts on relationships and dealing with politics and conspiracy theories.
Yeah, I think just, I guess, kind of bringing it together in terms of what we've been talking about today. I think it's really encouraging, and you yourself making sure that you're accessing good quality, reliable information, and that you're sharing that with your loved ones, and you're sharing it openly, but not aggressively. I guess I would say.
Don't be aggressive. Don't be aggressive.
It doesn't work, unfortunately.
Aggressive news sharing. That's a vibe. And Matthew, final words to you on, how to get out of this misinformation dumpster fire that we live in.
Well, it all starts with each of us. And so, I encourage people to check out our Break the Fake resources at breakthefake.ca. There's a workshop that's for all audiences. There are tip sheets, there are videos, there are also lesson plans that can be delivered in the classroom that teach 4 quick and easy to learn steps for verifying information. Most of these won't take you more than a minute once you learn how to do it. And we also have material on how to respond to mis or disinformation in different contexts. So times when you feel confident disagreeing with someone, or sometimes maybe in another context, like when you're talking to a relative, when you don't want to disagree overtly, there are still effective ways that you can respond when you see someone sharing mis or disinformation.
This has been a wonderful conversation. Brian McQuinn, Matthew Johnson, Kara Fletcher, thank you all for your perspectives and your advice today. I think that some families will be stronger for it this Easter weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Lois wanted to know, will this show be shareable? The answer to that is yes. It will be posted on our CBC Listen app this afternoon. Just look up CBC Blue Sky. You can find it and share it. It will be also posted to the CBC Saskatchewan YouTube channel this weekend. And that you can share everywhere because YouTube is not blocked by Meta. So do share that with your friends and family.